Right, so apparently Nigel Farage is now running Tory 2.0. That's the latest genius observation from the Westminster bubble. Because Robert Jenrick's jumped ship to Reform UK, and suddenly the left-leaning press pack are having an absolute field day. Ooh, nasty Nige. How can racist Reform claim to be a proper far-right party if you keep welcoming these tired old Tories? Brilliant stuff, really. Pulitzer-worthy journalism, that. Quick favor, if this sounds like the kind of no-nonsense political analysis you're after, smash that subscribe button. Over 94% of you haven't yet. It's completely free, takes literally 2 seconds, and honestly means everything to us here at British Mirror. Cheers if you did. Right, let's tear this ridiculous narrative to shreds. Here's the thing about Westminster journalists. Bless them, really. They spend so much time obsessing over the ins and outs of Southwestern One, tracking who's lunching with whom at the Cinnamon Club and which special advisor whispered what into which ministerial ear, that they developed the political equivalent of tunnel vision. They're so deep in the bubble that they can't see what's blindingly obvious to everyone else living normal lives outside Zone 1. And this Tory 2.0 nonsense? Perfect example. My gut tells me that actual human beings, the ones who don't spend their Saturday nights reading parliamentary early day motions for fun, couldn't give a monkey's about this story. It's a manufactured storm in a Westminster teacup, the sort of tragic, self-important drama that gets political hacks' hearts racing, whilst the rest of Britain is wondering whether they can afford their energy bills this winter. But let's play along for a moment, shall we? Let's assume this story actually catches on. Let's pretend it poses some existential threat to Reform UK. Here's precisely why that threat crumbles faster than a Jacob Rees-Mogg Brexit promise the moment you apply even the tiniest bit of critical thinking. For years, decades even, we've been absolutely bludgeoned with this idea that the Conservative Party is this magnificent broad church, so inclusive, so diverse, so wonderfully accommodating. You've got your most sycophantic Europhiles holding hands with your most unabashed Brexiteers, all singing Kumbaya under one big blue tent. Aren't they marvelous? What unity, what strength through diversity of thought. Except, here's what that actually means in practice. It means the Tory party contains an entire right flank, a substantial chunk of MPs and members who are fundamentally more aligned with the concerns of ordinary voters than the soggy middle managers who've actually been running the show. These are the people worried about immigration, about sovereignty, about national identity, about the fact that promising to cut immigration and then presiding over record immigration is, shall we say, not exactly cricket. So what happens when that entire flank, these right-leaning conservatives, who've been increasingly frustrated with their own party's direction, starts defecting to Reform? What does that tell us? Does it tell us that Reform is becoming Tory 2.0? Does it hell? It tells us something far more important. It tells us there's absolutely zero reason to vote Conservative anymore. Think about it. If all the Tories who actually believe in controlling borders, who actually want to reduce immigration, who actually give a damn about British sovereignty, if they all bugger off to Reform, what's left? I'll tell you what's left. The Conservative Party dominated entirely by the very political tendencies that have comprehensively, spectacularly, almost impressively failed the United Kingdom over the past 14 years. You know what I'm talking about. The tendency to promise one thing and deliver the complete opposite. The tendency to talk tough on immigration whilst immigration hits record highs. The tendency to bang on about cutting taxes whilst the tax burden reaches levels not seen since the 1940s. The tendency to lecture about family values whilst presiding over policies that make it harder than ever for young families to get by. The tendency to promise to fix the NHS whilst waiting lists spiral into the stratosphere. Shall I go on? Because I can go on. I've got all day. The Westminster media class wants you to believe that if Reform welcomes Conservative defectors, it's somehow becoming contaminated, diluted, transformed into Tory light.
But that's exactly backwards. What's actually happening is a sorting process. The conservatives who still believe in conservatism, who haven't been completely captured by managerialist centrism and progressive social policy, are finding a new home, and the Tories who remain are simply revealing what their party has truly become: a party of high tax, high immigration, low growth, and even lower expectations. Given that I'm almost certainly not voting Labour, because let's be honest, Keir Starmer has all the charisma of a particularly uninspiring PowerPoint presentation about workplace safety regulations, and given that my actual favourite political party, the SDP, are about as likely to form the next government as I am to replace Gareth Southgate as England manager, well, such a wave of defections would actually clarify things beautifully. It would make my decision easier, not harder, because unless reform unveils, I don't know, Anna Soubry as a candidate, which would be the political equivalent of Arsenal signing Tottenham's worst player just for a laugh, I'm not particularly worried that the party's condemned to repeat the mistakes that drove me absolutely spare during the Tories' 14-year masterclass in disappointment.
Now, to be fair to universities, the government has been taking steps to address these issues. The Office for Students was handed more powers to examine complaints from speakers, students, and staff regarding free speech infringements. In August of last year, new rules were unveiled binding universities to actively support academic freedom and ensure students can freely engage in discussions without fears over censorship. The regulations also scrapped non-disclosure agreements intended to silence campus misconduct victims, which is genuinely positive. If a university is accused of suppressing free speech, the Office for Students now has authority to investigate and take action. The University of Sussex was hit with a £585,000 fine over failure to uphold free speech just last year. So there are consequences now, real financial consequences, for universities that don't protect open debate. But here's the problem. You can mandate free speech from the top down. You can threaten fines and investigations. You can create all the policies and procedures you want. But if students themselves don't value free expression, if they genuinely believe that banning people they disagree with is acceptable or even virtuous, then no amount of regulatory oversight will fix the underlying cultural problem. This isn't about university administrators being too restrictive. This is about students themselves demanding restrictions. That's much harder to solve because you're fighting against attitudes and beliefs, not just institutional policies. Let's think about why this might be happening, because understanding the cause is essential to finding solutions. One factor is undoubtedly social media, which has created environments where people can curate their information diet to include only views they already agree with, where disagreement is often met with blocking or muting rather than engagement, where pile-ons and public shaming are used to enforce conformity. Students raised in that environment might genuinely not understand the value of encountering challenging ideas because they've never had to seriously engage with them. Another factor is probably the increasing politicization of everything. When politics stops being about competing visions for society and starts being about good people versus evil people, it becomes much easier to justify silencing the evil people because you're not just disagreeing with them, you're protecting society from harm. That's a dangerous mindset because it treats political opponents as enemies to be defeated rather than citizens to be persuaded. There's also potentially an element of risk aversion. This generation of students has grown up being told that words can be violence, that certain ideas are literally dangerous, that exposure to the wrong viewpoints can cause psychological harm. If you genuinely believe that, then banning speakers isn't censorship, it's safeguarding, it's protecting vulnerable people from harm.
The problem is that ideas, even offensive ones, aren't actually violence. They might be uncomfortable, they might be upsetting, they might challenge deeply held beliefs, but that's not the same as physical danger. We've conflated emotional discomfort with actual harm, and the result is a generation that thinks protection from discomfort is a right, rather than encountering challenging ideas being a necessary part of education and growth. But here's what really gets me about this survey, and it's the contradiction at its heart. These students are at university, supposedly the pinnacle of education, places where critical thinking is meant to be developed, where people learn to analyze arguments, evaluate evidence, and form independent judgments. And yet significant numbers of them don't trust themselves or their peers to hear certain political views without being corrupted or damaged by them. What does that say about their confidence in their own beliefs? If your worldview is so fragile that it cannot withstand exposure to Reform UK or Labour politicians giving a talk, maybe the problem isn't the speakers. Maybe it's that your beliefs haven't been tested and refined through genuine intellectual challenge. There's also something deeply patronizing about the attitude underlying these bans. It's essentially saying, I'm sophisticated enough to hear these ideas without being influenced by them, but other people aren't, so we need to protect them. That's not equality, that's elitism. That's assuming you have superior judgment, whilst everyone else is vulnerable to manipulation and needs you to decide what they can hear. Students should be treated as adults capable of making their own judgments about arguments they encounter, not children who need protecting from bad influences.